My name is Haley, and I'm going to be presenting today on how to speed up your workflow. My sort of subheader is Tips from a CET Grandma. So let's get started. So I'm going to start off with our agenda for today. I'm going to start with an introduction of myself and kind of some real life concepts that go along with this topic. And then we're going to transition into CET specific concepts. And at the end, we're going to take just a couple of minutes to talk about some next steps and how to purposely implement something to move forward with some of these topics. So a little bit about me. My name is Haley. I live in Beaufort, Georgia, which is a suburb of Atlanta. I have been married to my husband for 14 years, and we have two kids who are 5 and 8. So we are very busy with all the kids' activities and school things and things like that. So I definitely appreciate anything I can do to make my life more efficient. I enjoy watching UGA football. My husband and I met at UGA, so we enjoy doing that together. We like to camp and visit national parks. And I love to read. Almost every evening you will find me reading. It's how I relax. Another thing about me is I'm an Enneagram type 1. So if you're familiar with the Enneagram, the type 1s are very detail oriented and regimented and sometimes perfectionist. I go into detail about that because my company talks about it a lot, but also because it kind of informs some of the things I will show you today on like how I like things to be lined up really nicely and things like that. So that's a little bit about me personally. Some of my information about my CET experience. So I have 15 years experience as a dealer designer, and I currently work at a Hayworth dealer. I started off in Steelcase. So my first job right out of college was in Steelcase, and I actually learned to draw, their frame and tile panel system called Answer in CET and in CAP at the same time, CAP and AutoCAD at the same time. So I feel like that informed a lot of how I learned as well, because I've learned both ways at the same time. And I had a few, kind of old clients who, had been in AutoCAD for years and years, and CET was new at the time. So I had to learn both. I began using CET in June of 2010, which is right after I graduated. So depending on how you count, depends on whether I would count of using CET for 15 years or not. I took a little break from using CET when I worked at a Technion dealer, because at the time that I worked at that dealer, they only had walls in CET and I did not do walls. So that informs a little bit of my CET experience as well. I was featured as the CET Designer of the Month in July 2013. So that's what that little office rendering is from. So CET used to send out a paper calendar, and they'd feature a rendering and have a little blurb about the person whose rendering it was. And I used to have my paper copy, and I can't find it anymore. And this is my second time presenting at the CET conference. I led a breakout session in 2021. That's back when COVID was in full force and it was all online. So this is my first time presenting in person. So I'm really excited about that. All right. So you might be a CET grandma if I'm from Atlanta. Jeff Foxworthy is from Atlanta. So this makes me chuckle a little bit. You might be a redneck if guy. So you might be a CET grandma or grandpa if you remember receiving the desk calendars in the mail, or if you remember a time before there was a CET experience. I remember the very first one. My coworker won tickets. We went to NeoCon and she entered a raffle at NeoCon and she won tickets to the very first CET experience, which was also here in Orlando. You might be a CET grandma if you know what a key binding is. So tip, that is what they used to call keyboard shortcuts. So in my grandma brain, I still call it a key binding, and I confuse all my coworkers with that. You might be a CET grandma or grandpa if you still use the P for your keyboard shortcut for position. I know a lot of people set this as M, but back when CET first came out, that was the automatic keyboard shortcut was P. So I still use P because old habits die really hard for me. And you might be a grandma if you try to use A as a keyboard shortcut in all of your other programs. And when I first learned that keyboard shortcut, it was another. A is for another. And then this is what AI thinks I will look like as a grandma. So it's kind of amusing to put that into my phone and see what that would think, what that thinks I look like. My kids thought that I looked really funny when I showed them that. So let's talk about some real life concepts next about just speeding up your workflow in general. And this doesn't just have to do with work. It also has to do with all the things you do anything you do repeatedly. So I looked at some kind of funny memes about speeding up your workflow, or like, what are things that are hacks? One of these things I would totally do. The other thing I probably wouldn't do. I'll let you decide which of those two is which. So habits are things that are deeply ingrained in our brains because of repetition. So Google says that forming a new habit takes around 66 days. I think that depends on what kind of habit it is. Like, is it a habit of something you do one time a day? Then maybe it takes 66 days. Is it a habit of something you do 3 or 4 times a day, or 3 or 4 times an hour, as some things are? I think those types of habits can actually be formed even faster than that. It just depends on how many repetitions. So the important thing about habits is that they become automatic over time. So you don't have to think about them once you've done it enough times to make it into your habit. So that's what we're trying to do here, is take things that make your life easier, make you go a little bit faster, make you a little bit more efficient, and turn those things into habits. So a hack is kind of a clever habit. It's something not everybody thinks about or does the same way. So how do we take those hacks and turn them into habits? And what are some hacks that work for me that might work for you? So the goal of intentionally modifying your habits is not to do something the same way that everybody else does it, but to find what works best for you. I've always been a typer. So keyboard shortcuts and things like that I'm going to talk about later are just like ingrained in me. When I first learned AutoCAD when I was in college, I learned it with typed commands, and that's how I've worked ever since. If you were taught a different way, then clicking buttons might be more intuitive to you. And if that's what works for you, then there are other hacks you might develop that help you to continue to be efficient using those. Another thing to think about is, what are things you can do repeatedly that could benefit from streamlining? So focus on the things that you do on every project, or that you do on 80-90% of your projects, and try to streamline those things first. And then if you have time to streamline things you don't do as often, the things you do 30-40% of the time, then you can kind of focus on those. But let's kind of get the big hitters out first and streamline some of those things. And then try to figure out where are areas where the technology can help you, and what are areas where the technology doesn't help, you just have to do it, basically. So I'm going to talk about some things like that. So here are some real life examples. These sort of screenshots on the right-hand side of the screen are some things that I saw on Instagram. It's super popular at the moment, that people are like, I want your tips for this, not like your, run-of-the-mill everyday tips, but like your really wild tips. And so I found some of the ones that kind of resonated with me on there. I'm not going to read them all, especially because this is a recording, so you can pause it if you want to read them all. But my favorite one is this one on the bottom right here, and says that she cooks the same thing on a 4-week rotation. So she came up with 4 weeks of meal plans, and then she has either an Instacart order or a Walmart pickup order or a Kroger pickup order, whatever she uses, saved for those weeks. And all she has to do is say, okay, I also am out of Cheerios this week. I'm also out of laundry detergent, and add those things in, and it saves her time. And so we're going to talk about this later. It did take her some time to set that up. At some point, she sat down for a couple hours probably and set that up. Or she's, spent a little more intentional time thinking about what was in the meals for those 4 weeks. And then when she ordered it, she made sure she saved that. But it will save her a lot of time. So a lot of the hacks that people shared were about meal planning and prep, laundry, and taking care of their kids and automating things. So automating things I think is really important too. I have a lot of emails for work set up to automatically go into folders. So if it's a marketing email from whoever, Hightower, Encore, Material Bank, any kind of marketing email, I have slowly set up rules that anything that comes from those sort of emails goes into a folder. So it's not cluttering up my inbox. I can still go see it. I can see when I have unread messages there, but it's not cluttering up my inbox. I also have rules set up so that anything that's like sent to the whole company goes into a folder for that, because likely that's important information and things I need to know, but not usually things I need to respond to immediately. So then this photograph here on here of the calendar, that is how I actually do my meal planning. So when I sit down to do meal planning at the beginning of the month, I have found it's easier if I plan my whole months at a time, because I can be like, oh, we're having pasta this week. Maybe we won't have pasta next week. We'll have, more of an Asian meal with rice instead. So it helps me kind of have more variety. And the other thing it helps me do is I freezer cook. So this started right before I had my daughter, I had cooked some meals for myself, just kind of stock up my freezer for when she was born. And then I've kept doing this for almost 9 years now. She'll be 9 in about a month. And what I do is on Sundays is usually a day that I have more time to get dinner ready, and a time that my husband is home so he can kind of, run interference between my kids and when they were little, physically keep them out from under my feet when they were younger. But that's a time when I will intentionally double a recipe and then I'll put it in the freezer. So we will eat it twice that week. So if I cook it on Sunday, we'll usually have it on Wednesday or another day later that week. So I cook on Sunday and I double it and we have it later that week. And then I split the doubled recipe into 2 smaller portions that are enough to feed our family of 4 and put those in the freezer. So every week I put 2 things in the freezer and then I take 2 things out of the freezer, so that I basically usually cook on Sundays and Tuesdays, and between leftovers and pulling things out of the freezer, we have homemade meals 6 days a week, and then usually 1 day a week we go out to eat. So that is something that works really well for me, but may not work for other people, depending on, if you have 4 kids, it's harder to double recipes because you need to eat more of that, recipe or whatever. So, but trying to figure out things that work for you to take a little stress out of your life, to save you some time, is kind of the idea. And we'll get into some CET-specific things in a minute. So here are some more like work type examples of ways to kind of streamline processes. So following your company standards, if you have company standards. So I actually kind of spearheaded implementing the company standards at my company this year. So that took a lot of time to set up, but it's going to really help everybody to streamline and to become more efficient. A lot of the things I'm presenting about in here, are kind of baked into those company standards as well. Another thing is continuous learning by attending webinars and continuing education. I can't tell you how many of the things I have incorporated into this presentation that I didn't even really learn, or I learned through a webinar, but it was not something that was part of the topic of the webinar. And I have a specific example later. But sometimes you learn little tips and tricks from people, and it's not part of the webinar. It's not part of, if it's a manufacturer presenting on their product or whatever, but you're like, oh, how did they do that? They did that really well. And you just kind of pick up on other little things. I already talked about some of the Outlook rules that I have set up. I also, the CET webinars, I have a calendar invite on my calendar that repeats on the very first of every month in the morning. And just to remind me to go look and see what are the new CET webinars, since they don't send out as many emails, which I'm thankful for. I like fewer emails, but I just go and look every month. If the webinar is of interest to me, I watch it. And if it's not of interest to me, I don't watch it. And I always watch the what's new in CET, 16.5 or whatever the next version coming out is. Those are really helpful. Another thing about is how can AI help you? When I wrote these design standards, sometimes I would kind of get my idea out on what I wanted, a sentence or a paragraph or a section to say. And it was just like the words weren't quite very polished. And it's like, I know that this makes sense in my head, but it's not going to make sense to other people. I threw it into Copilot right there in Teams. We use Microsoft products. So that's their AI engine, and said, hey, give me 3 other ways to say this. And it would spit out other ways. And usually the very first one was, okay, yes, that's exactly how I wanted it to sound. And that makes more sense than kind of what I word spat all over the document. And instead of me sitting there for 3 or 4 minutes figuring out how can I phrase this better, I just let that do it for me. So think of the things like that you can get AI to help you on. That's something I want to learn more about. I've tried a few things with like photo editing and whatnot that have not worked well. So see where it works and where it doesn't work. So kind of to summarize and to finish up this section before we jump into the CET specific topics. In essence, habits are what we do regularly, while hacks are about how we do things efficiently. So what we want to do is turn our hacks into habits so that we can speed up our workflow and make our life easier. So some side effects may include becoming the favorite designer, greater work satisfaction, enhanced work-life balance, positive performance reviews, raises, bonuses, especially hopefully those last 2. All righty. Just to say again, what works for you what works for someone else may not work for you. So don't feel like you have to do everything I do or everything somebody else does. Figure out what works for you. Another thing is, don't try to implement everything at one time. It's not going to be successful. So practice 1 to 3 new things until they're a habit, and then find a few more. So I'm always kind of on the lookout for new things, new keyboard shortcuts to learn, things like that. And then apply this in some other computer programs and areas. PowerPoint, Bluebeam. I just watched the Bluebeam topical little videos on Design Pop the other day and learned a lot. And, it took about 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes to set up some toolboxes in there. And it has super, super helped me with my workflow as far as color coding comments on double checks. So, this doesn't just apply to CET. I'm only going to talk about CET after I finish this little section, but think about ways you can be efficient in other programs as well. And keep in mind, too, that sometimes there's going to be time you have to put in on the front end to get these things set up, but it's going to pay off so much when you keep using those things that you set up. So sometimes there's some setup time, but that time investment is going to pay off. So let's jump into some CET contents now. So the first thing that I want to share about is reusable files. Reusable files are a fantastic way to speed up your workflow, and they are something that you can share with the rest of your team as well. So it could even be, if you have 3 or 4 or 5, 6 people on your design team, or even more, come up with a committee and kind of assign some of these things. But have people save favorites, have people save calculation settings, finish swatches, things like that. So this is something that I set up at the dealer that I was at before I came to the one I have been with them for the last 3 years. And when I was at that dealer, I was the only person who was experienced in CET. Everybody else was just starting to learn it. That company was a little bit of a late adopter for CET, which is also because they had been using Technion for a good while, but they were using a lot of Han at the time. They were no longer a Technion dealer, but they were using a lot of Han, and Han was in CET. So they started adopting CET, and I set these up for everybody to help us speed up and created a guide as well. So all of our CET reusable files are saved on a shared location where everybody can get to them. And then they're categorized, in subfolders. And these are the different subfolders we have. And, feel free to pause this recording and see, what these are. I'm not going to talk about every single one of them. But I do have a screenshot of what's inside the calculation settings as an example. So inside the calculation settings, I have all those .cmclc files, which are the actual calculation settings. But then there's also a JPEG with the same name. So if somebody wants to look at a JPEG of what those calculation files look like when you've imported it into your calculation, then they can do that. So I try to keep things well organized and clear and have little helper things like that. I'm going to jump back a slide for a second. In this guide that I've created, there are, typed out instructions with screenshots about everything. And then there's also video tutorials. So that video tutorial links to this MP4 video, and it's just me screen sharing and walking people through how to do these things. So I typically will sit down with a new hire and show them all the things that are in the CET reusable files guide. But depending on their level of comfort with CET when they start, or depending on, how busy they are when they first start or not busy, they may not actually look at it again for a long time, things like that. So having those videos makes them more comfortable to go find that information themselves instead of coming to me. I'm always really happy to help people, but sometimes I'm on vacation, or sometimes I'm in a meeting or have a deadline and I really can't take the time to stop and help them. So I'm trying to help people help themselves on things that I do repeatedly, which is to teach people about these things. The next thing I want to talk about is the template file. So I have authored 2 templates. I authored the template at my previous employer, and I have authored the template at my current dealership. And it is something that I would never want to work on a file without a template now that I've been using it for years. We have our schemes set up, or our styles set up for all of our different dimension styles. And a lot of these things are saved in those reusable files too, but it is the reusable files, we recommend to the people at my company that they use, and they're there as a resource. But some of those things are optional. Like if you like to look at the calculation view different than the settings that are in there, that's fine. Go ahead, look at your calculation view differently. But things like dimension styles and tagging and some of these notes that we have in here, those are required. It is mandatory to do it the same way for our installers and for our customers, especially when we have design firms and PM firms who see different projects that multiple people work on. We want to present a unified, consistent deliverable to our clients. So the template really helps with that. It has some reminders in there about, remember, don't forget your wire management. Remember, don't forget some touch-up paint and a master key, things like that. And I think templates can be kind of intimidating if you've never used one before, but it really helps to have kind of all that information set up for you. It also has a photo template set up that is my favorite photo settings, and just it's an easy photo setting. We do mostly white suites where I work. We don't do a lot of photos where we build up the walls and add a ceiling and things like that. So because we don't typically choose to do that type of rendering, the same settings work really well when you're just doing things on a white background. So that's already set up in there. So here's some other things that are pre-set up in the templates, is having the title blocks in there. So we have 2 sizes of title block in the template, but then we have reusable files for 4 or 5 other sizes if people need them. The photo lab is already set up to have, these post-processing settings, in a good setup for a white background rendering, things like that. We have categories for our dimensions, categories for labels, categories for notes, things like that, all already set up. So those things are in the reusable files and they're in the template. So say I opened up a drawing from 5-6 years ago and needed those things, I can bring them in as a favorite and go from there, or I can bring them in as a photo setup, things like that. Another thing you can do with a template is create a client-specific template. So this is something that I've only done for one client, and these are actual screenshots of what I've done for this client. So this is a client that has, when they have a busy season, they'll order 20 to 25 projects in about a 6-month period. And they kind of cycle where they'll have 6 months where they're really busy, and then they've spent all their money and they don't order any more projects. And they go into kind of like a shopping mall, strip mall type of location where they have 6 to 8 stations and a small huddle room, things like that. in them. So because of that, I can knock out these projects really quickly because I have all of the templates set up in all of their typicals set up in my template. And basically in my template, I have an alternative that's pretty much blank that has a title that says, location name. And then I have an alternative that has basically what's on this screen, which is all of my typicals in it. So all I have to do is they would send me a test fit showing me what they would want in there. And I would go into my alternative that has the typicals, and then I would copy paste the items I need, arrange them in there. And I could get them knocked out with a drawing, a budget, because we use an Excel spreadsheet for the budgeting. And so I had a template or a starter file for that as well. I can knock out all that stuff in 45 minutes to an hour for each project. The other thing is this client really had some customizations they needed the installers to do. And because they had so many different repeated locations, doing things like install drawings, having pages set up as the install drawings really helped. So this was some field cuts that they wanted on this table. It's kind of a shroud table with a screen on it, and they needed field cuts in certain places. They provided the TV and they provided the speaker bar, and they wanted those things installed in the same place and with the grommets in the same place in all the different locations. So I had to make this very detailed notes about how to install that and how to field drill those grommets. And after I did it once, got the client to approve it, all I have to do is copy paste and go with that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some photo lab tips. And this gets into me being a 1 on the Enneagram again. I like my photos to be lined up perfectly. And I'll kind of show you how that looks in real life here in a second. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can have, say you want to do, I'm going to say a 6-pack because that's what my actual example here is. Say you want to do a 6-pack and you have 3 finish options you want to show the customer. Well, if you have that in 3 separate alternatives and in the same place, you can open up those alternatives and have the one common photo series for all drawing alternatives. And you can render it, then switch to the next alternative and render it, and then switch to the next alternative and render it. And that works just fine. But there's another way you can do it where it keeps it all in one alternative so that you can do render multiple, and it kind of saves a couple minutes there. So both of them are fine ways to do it. There's certain situations where I do it the first way I talked about, where I have everything in a different alternative. And then there are certain situations where I do it the second way I'm going to show you. So what I like to do, and I'll show you this in actual CET here for a second. So in this drawing, I have 2 alternatives. I have my full plan, and then I have my workstation options. So in my workstation options, I have 3 versions of this workstation, and with 3, it's the same exact components, just different finishes. And I space them apart perfectly equally in my drawing view, so that when I am in PhotoLab, you can actually take your 3D view clip or your little view clip here, your green box, and your camera and move them by that distance. So I'm going to show you in real life. The photo lab. So I do have a separate unique photos for each alternative set up for this particular one. And I'm going to go back to this first rendering and just show you how I created that. So I'm going to go to 2D. And I'm going to click New Drawing. And all I am going to do is, because I set this up, this CET is being glitchy today about selecting multiple things. Of course, on the day I'm recording, it does that. So I typically will select the 2D view clip box and the camera at the same time and move them. But I am moving this and I'm hitting my arrow and then I'm typing in 20 feet. And that is going to set me up with the exact same view on my rendering. So I had already done this, so I had all three. But you can see when I flip from here to here that it's the exact same view of those renderings. So what I like about that is I could render all three of those at the same time and then save them. I almost always, when I'm doing a rendering like that and I'm rendering multiple things, I will set it to render multiple and then work on typing an email, or I'll set it to render multiple and then go get my lunch. Or I have been known to set it to render multiple and then drive home while it renders on my laptop. And then I just get home and I save all my renderings and then I close my laptop down for the day. So just ways to save time so that you're not sitting there waiting on your renderings to be done is a favorite tip of mine. So here's how these renderings look once they're done. I can kind of just go through the different finish schemes very quickly, kind of see what the differences are between them. I like to do this too. Say I have two office options and maybe one has an overhead and one doesn't, or one has an extra lateral file and the other doesn't. I like to render them in the exact same view for that situation as well, just so that people can see, it's like in the kids' magazines that find the differences. So it's obvious what the differences are. When the angle is the exact same, to me, it helps people to see what the differences are. All right, gonna take a sip of water. Been talking, but hopefully this is helpful information. Okay, this might be my top tip of the day. My favorite thing is blocks. I like to literally put every single item in a block. So I'm gonna pull up my CET again really quick and show you my block dialog in this particular drawing. Which that is keyboard shortcut B. So you can see everything is in a block, and then I have blocks within blocks. So if I click on this PO1, I have my accessory 1, 2, 3, like those are all blocks within the block. So my accessory 1 is my monitor arm, and that's the only thing in there. It's just the monitor arm. So why do I do this? Because this is one of those things, it does take a minute to set up beforehand. So where it pays off is when you start revising things. So this is a screenshot of this same drawing. The other day I opened it and the power unit, the manufacturer had updated the catalog, but the symbol wasn't repopulating correctly. So I needed to replace it. Well, instead of having to go 1, 2, 3 offices and 6 workstations and go put it on the desk and fix it, it was in a block. So I literally had to replace it 1 time instead of 9 times. So I did that in 1/9 of the time it would have taken me to do if I had to do it 9 times. Another way that I like to use blocks is, say somebody has planned to use single monitor arms the whole time, and then somehow at the end of the day, their IT people say, hey, wait, we're ordering 2 monitors for everybody. Or they say, oh, we actually have more money than we thought. Where do we want to do dual monitors? I can go and switch that single monitor arm for a dual monitor arm, and it takes me 2 seconds. If I had 500 stations or 100 stations, something like that, even if they were in cluster blocks, it would still take me a lot longer than having just the monitor arm in the block. So I do really recommend putting everything in a block and having blocks within blocks. Another thing I'll do is I'll create a value engineered floor plan option in like a quarter of the time. So there are lots of tools that are usually manufacturer extension specific for replacing items. So say like this is an OFS sync chair. Say I needed to replace that with a JSI chair or a Hayworth chair or a Han chair. Most of those chair replacement tools only work if you're going from OFS to OFS or going from, the same manufacturer for the first and the second option. So when something's in a block, you can replace things no matter what they are. You can replace them with whatever else you need to do. And I will use that. I've had several RFPs lately where I needed to do 2 full options for both RFPs. And one of them, they even told us the budget we needed to hit, and it was tough to hit that budget. So I did an option of what we we're truly recommending to the customer, not that money was not an object, but saying, okay, we know you're budget conscious, but we also know you've asked us for these particular items, and I did that budget. And then on that one RFP, they said, but we want you to give us an option that meets this number. And so I did a complete save as, and it was a big difference. We had to take like 40% out. So we were, taking some storage out of the offices. We were taking glass and some storage out of the workstations. We switched out the chair. We did some things like that. But I was able to, spend a lot of time drawing that first option. And then I did a complete save as of the drawing and drew that second option up using the blocks I had already set up in the first option, which made switching out all those products to do a value engineered option so much faster. Now, you can do that with alternatives as well. However, you have to be careful because when you have blocks, it's the same block in the alternatives. You would have to remember to clone all the blocks of everything you're changing. And that I have done it in alternatives before and forgotten to clone the blocks. And then you have to go back and redo stuff. So my recommendation is if you're doing a full VE version to do a save as and to have one drawing with all your blocks for your regular version, one drawing with all your blocks for your VE version. Another quick tip is set up all your Photolab renderings before you create that VE option. That way you have similar renderings of both, and you've already set those up. Another thing I like to do in blocks is having the tag within the block. So we tag everything as CH01, CH02, ACC01, ACC02, TO1, for whether it's a chair, an accessory, a table. And having that tag inside the block means it's always going to get moved with that chair. And it means if I need to change the tag, it's in the block. And it just makes it easier for our installers. That's how they're used to looking at it. And then another thing that I like to do with blocks, you got to become familiar with this block dialog where you can replace blocks, you can clone blocks, you can do all kinds of stuff with the blocks in that dialog. And I like to render within my blocks sometimes, and I like to look at the calculation within my blocks sometimes. So I do know there is a session that is spending an entire hour on blocks at this year's CET experience. So if you want to know more about blocks, I'm sure that there's great information in that one. I would have totally chosen that topic as well, but lots of people love blocks, so I definitely encourage you to check it out. Okay, some other favorite tools that I have are replicate tools. So this is something that I feel like my gap in CET kind of plays into, because these replicate tools, which they teach on in I think most of the trainings now, I think were released in the 2 or 3 years when I was not using CET and I was not going to those, what's new in webinars. So in the tools toolbar, this circular replicate is really the only one I use because I find these ones to be confusing because they're not the ones that I learned originally. That's another thing where what works for me may not work for you. These 2 replicate tools might work perfectly for you and they may be what you need. I prefer this replicate tool, which I have a keyboard shortcut for, which is Control R, because you type in more things and then you hit apply. It's a little more, you can think about it more on the front end to me instead of having everything be in the green properties box like the other tool. But I love using these tools, and it's something that I use fairly often. So I like to use that keyboard shortcut so that I don't have to click on object and then go down and find the replicate. But I recommend using those to kind of speed up your workflow. I love keyboard shortcuts, and I have keyboard shortcuts set up for the align and distribute commands. So if you wanted to align and distribute, you can come to object and align and do that. You can use this little pop-out toolbar too, which I think you go to tools. Let's see, I should have looked this up before. See, this is not how I do it either. Tools, align and distribute. Yep. So I will show you that really quick right here. You go to tools and align and distribute, and then it pops up this little pop-up. But I have done this for many years now using keyboard shortcuts. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what I mean by that. So if I have a chair and I have a bunch of them, I have keyboard shortcuts to align them, or excuse me, I can align them all down by hitting D and distribute them all horizontal by hitting H. So if I didn't want to use that replicate toolbar, which is right here, I just pulled that up with my keyboard shortcut. I could do it like this. And this is usually how I will arrange chairs around a conference table. So I'm going to explode this block. Let's say I have a little bit longer conference table here, and I need to put my chairs around it. Oops, did not delete that. So I'll just come through here, and I'll put my chairs around the table, and I'll align them up, distribute them horizontally. And then I will copy them using the A command, and I'll kind of align them using my position command. Oops. No, we're supposed to all be selected there. So I'm using position, and then I hit the right arrow so that it goes to the right, and I'm going to toggle it up. So now I've got my table, I've got my chairs, and then all right, this is where CET is being a little bit finicky today. So what I want to do is grab this, there we go. It's been being weird about selecting things when you hit down control today. So hopefully when I actually present live, it will not do that. But if I hit H, it will align that table in between those two chairs. And if I hit V, it'll align them vertically so that my table and my chairs are perfectly aligned. This again goes into me being a 1 on the Enneagram and really, really liking things to be aligned perfectly. And then I'll even do that with my end chair. So and I will align that one vertically between those two chairs. So I could have also just done it like this and positioned it from the middle of my block to the middle of the table. Those both work. And then if I want this chair scooted in at the same distance from the table, I can give myself a help line, which I also have a keyboard shortcut for, mirror that help line, which I also have a keyboard shortcut for, and then use my position, and then my chairs are perfectly aligned around my table. Again, I twitch a little bit if things are not perfectly aligned around my table. That's just me. Some people, that doesn't bother them, but I like my drawings to all be aligned with my chairs around my table. So these are my keyboard shortcuts for aligning down, left and right, and up, and distributing or spacing evenly, horizontal and vertical. If I go on somebody else's computer, like if somebody asks me for help or I have to borrow a loaner computer if mine's broken or something, I just go and set these up because otherwise I'll be sitting there hitting these buttons so many times a day. So this is one of those things where, I was talking about building habits, and it depends on how many times a day you do it. This is one of those things, I use these 3-4 times an hour, not just 3-4 times a day. Because it's just one of my favorite things and I use it all the time and it's a habit of mine. Another thing that I learned, this is the example of the thing that I learned on a webinar that was not, this was not part of the topic of the webinar. It was actually a Han webinar, and Harmony, I don't know if she's still at Han anymore because I don't really use Han anymore. I used it a lot at my previous dealer, but they would do monthly webinars, and I learned this from her, that you can change the elevation of things using the page up and page down buttons, and then you can get them to back to 0 elevation by hitting the home key. So I have highlighted on here where on your keyboard those things are, and I put some accessories in this drawing so that you can kind of see. So say this purse was really supposed to be on the floor, but when I brought in the accessory, it just automatically snapped to sit on top of my table. If I hit home, it'll be on the table. And then this little tablet guy accessory, he's just fine. So I don't need to adjust his elevation. But this telecomforts thing, it came at the wrong elevation. So if I hit page up on my keyboard, it will page that up. And if I hit control page up and down, it will go at smaller. So that's page up, page down. Control makes it go at smaller bumps. So if I want to get it just perfectly on top of there, I can. So that is how how you can easily and quickly change the elevation. I use that on the monitors a lot. And then when things come in at a weird elevation, like they do sometimes, you can do that. I know there's another quick tip. Let's see. Using that replicate tool, that circular replicate tool, come in. Don't have the middle on here. Or don't. All right. So if I want to bring these in, if I have keep elevation checked on here, it's actually had been making them float in the air, and it's not making them float in the air anymore. But it used to be that you would come in and if you use that tool, all of your chairs would be up here in the air, and your table would be where it's supposed to be. And I would just have to come in here and hit home, 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 home. And then they'd all go back down. Instead of clicking on each, then changing the elevation, clicking on the next one, changing the elevation, just one button, one keyboard shortcut to speed up that. And there are also align top and bottom elevations. So like if you have overheads or something like that, or tech boards that are floating on a wall that you need to align, there's things in there for that. All right. I do know that I have mentioned this a couple times when I've been in CET demonstrating things, but arrow keys, toggling things to keep them in a straight line is really nice. But did you also know that if you have something at a funny angle and you hit the arrow key twice, it will snap it to that funny angle? So this example up here, it would not snap to a funny angle if you hit it twice because there is no funny angle. But this one, I rotated it to 306 degrees and it will keep it snapped to that. So if I hit the right arrow key once, it will move it directly to the right. But if I hit the right arrow key twice, it'll pick up on that angle, but those things are already rotated too. And I used that when I set up those identical photo views of those workstations when we were looking at that earlier. Help lines. I use help lines all the time. You saw that just a minute ago when I was putting the chairs around the table. I love help lines. I made myself a keyboard shortcut for them. The keyboard shortcut is J, which may not make any sense, but it's close to L. It's close to H, so those are for help line. I already used H for my distribute horizontal, so I'll show you again what my H does. So my H will make those evenly spaced out. So I couldn't use H for help line. So I use J for help line. And I'll show you really quick how I drew that help with help line. So I just took that line and did Shift M, which is what the keyboard shortcut I have set up for mirror. And then I copied it. And I copied these lines. Use my D to align down and my U to line up. Then I copied the lines I needed for the L. Copy the lines I needed for the P. Use my J again. And there I have my help written using help lines and my other tricks and fast things that I do. So the more you use a tool, the more you're going to find other ways to use it and things to help you. So help lines and mirroring, I really love to help things to be lined up perfectly because I like things to be lined up perfectly. And it keeps me able to line things up perfectly without spending too much time on it. All right, some other favorite tools I have are Control F for filtering. So this example here has all of my install notes, all of my details, all of my dimensions on it. If I needed to, I typically don't add all those notes and dimensions until I'm doing my install drawings. But then sometimes, they come back and say, oh, we need to add 2 more workstations, or, oh, we need to do this or that. And all that stuff gets in the way. So filtering it this is just a reminder, you can filter it to turn those things off so that you don't accidentally edit them when you're not trying to edit them, and so that they're not in your way when you're trying to revise a drawing. This is another thing that I think I learned on a Han webinar back in the day. But if you are trying to select something and you're having a hard time getting it to select properly, if you hit Control and right click, it will bring up a dialog box. So I'll show you right here. It says, do you want to pick up the phone, the block, or the DWG file. If I go a little bit to the side, actually, if you zoom out more, it'll be close to more things. So I'm like, okay, yes, I want to edit this block. So if you are trying to select a dimension and for the life of you, it will not select. I feel like that's what I get into a lot. I'm trying to grab a dimension so that I can adjust it or do something to it. And for the life of me, sometimes it's like, why won't you select my dimension? Or I'm trying to select the table and it just wants to select the chair every time. Hitting that control and right click will help you to select. Then you can pick what you want to select from that drop down menu. Hiding things in print. So this is another thing that I kind of stumbled on accidentally. I don't remember ever learning it in a training, but if you have things that you never want to show in print, you can right click them and hide them in print. This does not work for things like a chair per se. Doesn't usually work for smart symbols. It usually only works for things like text, things like pick lists. So I pretty much never want my customer to see a pick list. That's confusing to them, in my opinion. So I almost always right click and hide it in print. I was working on one of those projects earlier today where I had a full drawing for the main option and then a full drawing for a VE option. On the VE option, I put in big red text across it, like this is the VE option, and then I hid it. That way, when I was flipping back and forth between the drawings, I didn't have to look at the top view, the top toolbar to say, okay, am I editing the right drawing? This is an edit I need to make in this drawing, not in the other one. Another thing that I will do, bring my CET back up here again. I have those accessories in that conference room now, and those are things I never want to show up in print. So this is like my electrical drawing. I don't need those in my electrical drawing. But in order to go back and turn off accessories, I have to go into every single paper view that I already have set up and turn those off. But if I grab those, right click and hide them in print, then I can go back and it's hidden in this print view, it's hidden in this print view. But every single view, those items are now hidden. I might have accidentally grabbed my AutoCAD plan. I think I accidentally grabbed my AutoCAD plan. Right click, show in print. I did not do that on purpose, but that's the other thing I was actually going to say, even though I did not do that on purpose, is if for the life of you, you cannot figure out why something will not show up in your paper view, go and check and make sure you didn't accidentally click hide and print on that thing. I've had that happen before. I've had coworkers come to me and be like, I cannot get this thing to show up in print. I've done everything. And this was what was, behind that issue. So it's something to troubleshoot if you cannot get something to show up in pay-per-view. All right. I am running out of time, so I'm going to try to go through this quickly. But there are still things that seed drawings are useful for in CET, even now that we have template files. So I have two that I'm going to share. I'm sure there are other things that I can't think of right now, but I use this stop motion video seed file. So this is one of those things I do 3 or 4 times a year. It's not something I do on every project, but now that I have it set up, it just takes me a couple, maybe half an hour to an hour to do this anytime I need to. So basically what this does is it is a seed file where I have the same cluster of workstations in a block, and then I rotated the block, I think 2 degrees every time, and then moved it 20 or 25 feet every time. And then I set up all my photo views so that the camera angle is exactly the same, and moved that camera angle, 20 feet, 25 feet, whatever it was, so that I can then go in and render multiple. And basically then I have a PowerPoint file that you can export as a video, and it will rotate your drawing around. So this is a fake client. I'm sure there's somebody called Smith Law, but I didn't actually do any furniture for them. But this is what it looks like when you do it. So CET took away the movie studio functionality because everybody was just going to Twinmotion or sending it to a contractor. It wasn't very popular, but we still had the need to kind of make this sort of thing quickly. So I kind of got inspiration from a design pop video and learned how to do this. The next thing I think this is going to show you, I hope I kept this in my example one. Yeah. I also will do 2 renderings and have them fade out. So those other ones are 20 to 30 renderings to create the moving thing, but you only need two renderings to create it fading from goodness gracious, one finished scheme to another scheme. You only need a rendering of one scheme and a rendering of the other scheme, and you just change the transparency in PowerPoint before you export it. So that's something that I use a seed file for. And, feel free to go back and watch this video again since this is a recording. Okay, then the other thing I use a seed drawing for is I have an item image seed drawing. So we do basically a rendering of each chair by itself to go on our spec pages that we show the customer. And we put that into a budget format for the customer because customers are visual. They don't understand, what that chair looks like unless you show them a picture of it. And they don't remember the name of the chair from their showroom visit. They need to see the picture. And then they say, yeah, that's the chair I wanted. So I set up a seed drawing that has all my photo views set up already for those item images. And this is something I just did within the last few weeks. So sometimes it makes sense for me to use this on a project, and sometimes it doesn't make sense for me to have a separate CET file just for my renderings. But when it is something I want to do, it's already set up for me. So I'm going to show you really quick how I would actually use that. So if I needed to make item images of all of these things, sometimes what I like to do is I will go into the actual block and I will render it in the block. So that's what I did in this. This is a pretend project I did for our design standards. So I will go in the block and render it in the block. But that means I have to go in the block, change the floor color, open up PhotoLab, set up my photo every single time. So if I want to set it up in this seed file, I can go to this item image template, and I just brought in all of my furniture, and I have chair blocks set up in here. So I can go to B in my block dialog, and I can say, okay, chair 1, I'm going to replace so I can replace this block, chair 1. My chair 2 from this drawing is this chair. I can replace that one, chair 2. I can replace chair 3. I had already set this up. I did this already, but you get the picture. So I just replace all my blocks here, and I have 25 of them set up. I probably won't use them. And then I have an alternative set up for my tables. So then I can go replace these tables. And then I have one set up for storage and other things. So that when I need to do my renderings, I already have those all already set up. They're named CHR1, CHR2, CHR3. And I might have to tweak them a little bit, but I don't have to go and set every single one of them up. Now, this is taking a second for PhotoLab to open because I do have 25 renderings set up in there. And then instead of going into each block, hitting render, I can do my render multiple, go to my tools, render multiple, I can just select the 5 I need to do. And then I also have my post-processing settings already set up on all of these renderings. So just if I'm in a hurry, and some projects, this is a time saver, and some projects it's not. And I will use that. Okay. So now is the time for question and answers, but this is a recording, so I'm going to skip over this slide. And we're going to just talk very briefly about some next steps. So what are some things you can do to implement some of these things? Write down 1 to 3 things that you want to continue, cut, and cultivate. So what do I mean by that? And this is not my idea. I got this from a consultant firm that's been doing some leadership type lunch and learns with my company. Continue is what's something that's working really well for you that you want to continue. So, maybe you're in a really good habit of exercising, or you're really good about following your company standards. And write down those things and keep doing them. Then write down 1 to 3 things that you want to cut. So back years ago, I got into a bad habit. There was a Wendy's on my way home, and like maybe once a week, maybe twice a week, every now and then, I would just grab a small fry from Wendy's on my way home. That would be an example of something to cut. I don't work near a Wendy's anymore, but I've cut that out. Or the actual example I did when this consultant firm worked with us, as far as something that I cut, was working unnecessary overtime. And what I mean by that is I mostly work from home. And so I would think, oh, if I just do 10 more minutes, I'll finish this thing and I can check it off of my to-do list. Well, that was turning into 30 to 40 minutes. It always took me longer than I thought it was going to take. And so I decided, okay, no, I'm not going to, like, when it's time for me to be done, I'm going to be done. Unless I'm working on our RFP or a big deadline, I'm going to be done, and I'm going to stop trying to cross that one last thing. I'm just going to come back to it the next morning. And that has been a good thing for me to do. And then cultivate. What is 1 to 3 things that you want to begin to implement? So that could be cooking more at home or delegating more tasks to coworkers or things like that. So think of things like that. And then set a reminder on your phone for every few weeks, depending, to make sure you kind of stay consistent with those goals and that you make those things a habit. So that is all that I have today. I hope you found this to be helpful. I hope you found a couple of tips to start to implement, and that you will slowly but surely become a grandma like me and become faster at what you do. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.